woke up at 6:47 that morning. Not because my alarm went off. Not because the sun had already started coming through the blinds in that specific way that makes it impossible to pretend you're still sleeping. I woke up because my body had decided, without consulting me, that today was not a day for rest. I made coffee. Dark roast, 2 cups. The second one I didn't finish. I checked my phone. 32 unread messages, most of them from my assistant. 2 from my mother. None from anyone I actually wanted to hear from. I put the phone face down on the counter. I showered. I got dressed. I wore the gray blazer because it made me look like someone who had everything under control, which was a quality I needed to borrow from my clothes that particular morning. I drove to the office. Same route, same turn at the corner of 5th and Ambrose, same parking spot on the 3rd level that nobody else ever seemed to take because it was slightly farther from the elevator, and people who work in buildings like that one do not like to walk slightly farther than necessary. I sat in my car for 4 minutes before going inside. I know it was 4 minutes because I counted, not seconds. I just watched the clock on the dashboard and waited for something I couldn't name to settle back into its place inside my chest. It didn't. I went inside anyway. And I told myself, the way I had been telling myself for 11 days, every morning, in the parking garage and in the elevator and in the hallway outside my office, that today was going to be exactly like every other day. I was wrong, of course. I just didn't know it yet. Let me tell you something about Catherine Voss. Not the version of her that ends up in profiles. Not the woman in the magazine photographs, with the sharp jaw and the sharper instincts, standing in some glass-walled boardroom, looking at the camera the way most people look at things they've already decided to acquire. I mean the real version, the one I had to learn slowly, the way you learn a language you were never taught, by immersion, by repetition, by making mistakes that cost you something. I didn't like her when I met her. That's not entirely accurate. Dislike requires some degree of attention. And when we first crossed paths, in the conference room on the 14th floor of Voss Industries, the week I came to work there, I didn't give her enough attention to form an opinion. She was a presence, a force of weather, the kind of person that a room reorganizes itself around without being asked. I was 31 years old, 2 years out of a relationship that had lasted longer than it should have, because I didn't know what I was looking for, and I was very good at mistaking familiarity for contentment. I had just taken the position of Director of Corporate Strategy at Voss Industries, and the only thing I cared about in those first weeks was proving that I deserved to be there. Catherine was the CEO. She was also, in ways I didn't have language for yet, the reason the walls in that building felt different from the walls in any other building I had worked in. More alive, somehow. Like the whole structure was breathing to the rhythm of whoever was at the top of it. We didn't speak directly in those early months. We didn't need to. There was a chain of hierarchy between us, several layers of senior vice presidents and department heads, and for a long time, that felt like the appropriate distance. Then came the merger. A deal with a company in Seattle, large, complex, the kind of negotiation that requires complete alignment at every level of leadership. Catherine's assistant called me on a Thursday afternoon and said, simply, that Ms. Voss would like me in the room for all working sessions going forward. I said, of course. I wore the gray blazer. And that was how we began. Not with a spark or a moment or anything that would make sense as the beginning of a story. Just 2 women in a conference room, across a table covered in papers, and me trying very hard to be useful to someone who seemed to already know everything she needed to know about every subject on the table. I noticed, in that first real working session, that she did not perform confidence. She simply had it. There was no performance in the way she sat, or the way she spoke, or the way she let silence exist in a room without rushing to fill it. I also noticed that she took her coffee black and didn't touch it until it had cooled almost completely. I noticed that when she disagreed with someone, she didn't raise her voice. She got quieter. I noticed that once, just once, when one of the legal team made a joke that landed, she smiled in a way that was completely different from her professional smile. Faster, more involuntary. Like it escaped before she had a chance to decide whether to let it out. I noticed that I noticed all of this, and I told myself it was simply the kind of attention you pay to someone you work closely with. Someone whose thinking you need to understand. That's what I told myself. I was very good at it. The merger negotiations lasted 4 months. By the 3rd week, we were meeting every day, sometimes for 6 hours, sometimes more. The Seattle team was complicated. They had a negotiator named Patricia who liked to make things personal right at the moment they were becoming productive. And Catherine had decided that I was the right person to manage that dynamic. I don't think she meant it as a compliment. I think she identified a skill and applied it. That was how she operated, clean and unsentimental, at least on the surface. But here is the thing about spending 6 hours a day with a person. You start to learn the things they don't say. You learn what a slight pause before an answer means versus a long pause. You learn which topics make someone's posture change. You learn the difference between the version of someone they show the room and the version that exists in the seconds between sentences. There was an evening in the 6th week, a Tuesday, late, everyone else had gone home, when Catherine and I were still going over the revised terms. I had been reading the same paragraph for the 3rd time, without processing a word of it. Outside the windows, the city had gone full dark. Inside, it was just the 2 of us, and the sound of papers, and the occasional traffic noise from 20 floors below. She said my name. Not the way she said it in meetings, when it was a prefix to a question or a directive. She said it in a different register. Quieter, slightly tired, and somehow more precise. The way a word sounds when someone uses it to get the actual attention of a specific person, rather than to summon a professional. I looked up. She was looking at me, not at the papers. At me. "You've been reading that same page," she said. "For 9 minutes. I didn't ask how she knew that. I didn't ask why she had been watching closely enough to know that. I said, "I'm fine." She said, "I know you are." And then she looked back down at her own papers. "We'll stop at 8. That was all. I drove home that night with the windows down, even though it was October, and the air was cold enough to be uncomfortable. And I kept thinking about the way she had said my name. Not obsessively, not dramatically, just... I kept thinking about it the way you keep thinking about a song you can't quite remember, but can't quite let go of either. I told myself it was nothing. 2 days later, she brought me coffee. I was already in the conference room when she arrived, early, as I always was. And she came in without her assistant, carrying 2 cups, and she set one in front of me without asking. Black, for herself. Mine had exactly the amount of cream I always added, which she had apparently noticed and memorized. She didn't mention it. She just sat down and opened her folder. I looked at the cup. I looked at her. She was already reading. I told myself that was nothing, too. But I stopped sleeping as well as I used to. Just slightly. An hour less, maybe. And in that hour, I would lie in the dark, and I would think about all the things I would need to do the next day. Which was a perfectly reasonable thing to think about. And sometimes, I would think about whether the merger was going to hold the way we needed it to, which was also a perfectly reasonable thing to think about. And sometimes I would just think about the way a room feels when a specific person walks into it. That was the part I didn't examine. There was a session near the end of the 8th week when Patricia from the Seattle team pushed back hard on a clause we had spent 3 weeks negotiating. She was strategic about it. She waited until everyone was tired, until the energy in the room had dropped to that particular low point that happens around 5:30 p.m. in a conference room that has been occupied since 9 o'clock, and then she introduced a reversion to terms we had already moved past. I watched Catherine. Catherine set her pen down. Very quietly, she said, "We're not revisiting that clause." Patricia started to respond. Catherine didn't interrupt her. She let her finish. And then, into a room that had gone completely still, she said, "I understand what you're trying to do, Patricia. It's a reasonable tactic. It won't work today." There was a pause. Patricia said, "I think we should take a break." Catherine said, "I agree." The room cleared quickly. I stayed to gather the documents from my side of the table, and when I looked up, Catherine was still standing at the window, looking out at the city. She had one hand braced against the glass, shoulders slightly dropped, like the hour had cost her something. For 2 seconds, maybe 3, she was not the CEO of anything. She was just a person who was tired. I turned away before she could catch me looking, but I could still feel it for the rest of the day. That 2-second version of her. The one that existed only in the space between performances. The one I had no business storing in my memory the way that I did. I started noticing things I had no reason to be noticing. The way she walked differently on the days when the pressure was higher. The way she held a coffee cup with both hands when she was thinking hard. Like the warmth was something to anchor to. The way her voice changed when she was talking to someone she actually trusted. Not warmer exactly, but slower, more open somewhere underneath the efficiency. I noticed all of it, and I kept telling myself it was professional attentiveness. I was very convincing. The merger closed on a Wednesday in early December. There was a dinner. Catherine's assistant coordinated it. A private room in a restaurant in Midtown. 12 people from the leadership teams on both sides. Polished and celebratory, and exactly as formal as everything in that world tended to be. I sat at the opposite end of the table from Catherine. That was just where the place cards were. It wasn't deliberate. But I was aware of her the entire night. The way you're aware of a light source in a room, even when you're not looking directly at it. After the main course, she stood to make a toast. The table quieted immediately. That particular quality of quiet that only certain people can generate, simply by rising to speak. She thanked both teams. She spoke about the work with genuine precision, naming specific contributions, which was not something I had expected. She didn't have notes. She spoke the way she did everything, like she had already thought it through completely, and what you were hearing was the finished version. Then she looked at me. Just for a moment, just 1 or 2 seconds of eye contact across a table full of people and wine glasses and candlelight, and she said, "And to the person who held the center of this process for the last 4 months, you know who you are." She lifted her glass. I lifted mine. I did not look away first. That was the first time I noticed that I didn't look away first. After dinner, people move toward the exit in the gradual way of people who have been in formal settings and need the decompression of coats and car services and goodbyes. I was standing near the window with the last of my wine, not quite ready to be outside yet, when I heard her voice behind me. "You handled Patricia well tonight." I turned around. Catherine was standing a few feet away. She had her coat on, which meant she was leaving. Her team was near the door. But she had stopped here, for this. I said something. I honestly can't remember what. Some response about the process or the outcome, the kind of professional deflection I was skilled at by then. She nodded slightly, and then she said, "What are you going to do next?" I thought she meant the next quarter, the next project, the next strategic initiative. I said something about the pending restructuring of the European division. She didn't say anything for a moment. And then, very precisely, "I meant tonight, after this." There was nothing particular in her tone. It was a simple question. People ask simple questions after work dinners. I said, "I'll probably just go home." She said, "Okay." And then, almost as an afterthought, "I walk sometimes, when I need to reset, along the park. In case you were ever, it's a good route." And then she was moving toward the door, and her team closed around her, and she was gone. I stood there with my half-empty glass, and the noise of the restaurant coming back in, and I thought about what she had just said. I thought about it for a very long time. I didn't walk along the park that night, but I started sleeping even less. The weeks after the merger closed were strange. The daily sessions ended. The constant proximity ended. I went back to my regular floor, my regular rhythm, the meetings and presentations and quarterly reviews that had defined my work before the 14th floor had become a second home. I told myself this was good. This was the correct calibration. I told myself I had been inside something intense, and now I was out of it, and my system needed to readjust. My system did not readjust. I kept waiting to stop noticing when she walked through a room. I kept noticing. There was a morning in January. Gray, early. The city still dark at 7:15. When I came in and found a single email in my inbox from Catherine. No subject line. The body of the email was 4 words: "Bring coffee if possible." I brought coffee. I went to her office, knocked, was told to come in, and she was at her desk, with papers on every surface, something she must have been up since 5 a.m. working on. She didn't look up immediately when I came in. She was reading. I set the cup down on the only clear corner of her desk. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Of course." I turned to leave. She said, "I've been reading your projections on the European restructuring." I turned back. She had still not looked up from whatever she was reading, but something in the room had shifted. The quality of the silence, maybe, or just the fact of being in that office in January, at 7:15 in the morning, with the city still dark outside, and a cup of coffee between us, on a desk covered in papers. She said, "Sit down for a minute." I sat, and we talked about the European restructuring for 40 minutes. That sounds ordinary. It was 40 minutes about numbers and timelines and organizational theory. But it was also the most present I had felt in a room with another person in a long time, completely awake, not performing attention, actually having it, like the part of my brain that was always half running a background process of self-monitoring had, for 40 minutes, gone quiet. I noticed that when I left. I noticed what its absence felt like. There was a day in February when I arrived at a company event and she was already across the room, talking to someone from the board. She looked up, just a glance, a fraction of a second, and there was something in it that I didn't know what to do with. She had seen me, not professionally, not in the way you see a colleague across a room. She had just seen me. And I stood there with a glass of water and the noise of the event around me, and I thought, something is happening. Something has been happening, and I don't know what to do with it, because I don't know what it is, and I don't know what it means, and I don't know what version of myself it belongs